It is late Monday night on this July 8th, 2013, and we are looking at the latest forecast track posted by the National Hurricane Center regarding Tropical Storm Chantal. Now, this is the 5 p.m. forecast track, but we're not expecting much in the way of changes with the 11 p.m. advisory. You can see that the maximum sustained winds have increased to near 50 miles per hour, despite the fact that the storm is moving west-northwest at a fairly rapid clip at roughly 26 miles per hour, and the latest intensity forecast is bringing the storm up to 70 mile per hour sustained winds as we work our way into the afternoon hours on Wednesday. So it would be no surprise if we start to see hurricane watches later on for portions of the Hispaniola coastline. Later on in the extended range, the Hurricane Center is forecasting the weakening of the storm into a tropical depression as it reemerges over the southwest Atlantic and the Bahamas, although it should be reiterated that the intensity forecast 4 and 5 days out is almost always highly uncertain, especially when you throw a lot of land into the mix. If the storm moves a little bit to the north of Hispaniola or a little bit to the south, this could give the storm more time over water. Therefore, there is the possibility that we could be dealing with a stronger tropical cyclone in the southwest Atlantic than otherwise being forecast at this time. In the short term, the intensity forecast models are showing modest strengthening to near almost Category 1 hurricane intensity before the storm moves over Hispaniola. Quickly thereafter, the storm does start to weaken. It could be a borderline tropical depression or a very weak tropical storm during this period. But if the storm reemerges back over the southwest Atlantic, which seems to be the model consensus this evening, we can anticipate more in the way of re-strengthening, especially if the center of circulation can avoid some of the highest mountains and terrain and simply decides to hug the coast of Hispaniola rather than pass directly over the large island. The magnitude of the tropical cyclone as it moves into the southwest Bahamas and starts to approach the southeast United States is still highly in question, as we are still yet to see how this storm is going to look once it exits Hispaniola, but based on the latest 18Z run of the American GFS ensemble members, we can see almost unanimous agreement with the track just to the south of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and then almost directly into Hispaniola. So we will likely see a weakening tropical cyclone pushing into the southwest Bahamas and then attempting to redevelop over the open waters. And as you can see, the models show a northwest turn, but then it follows up by another turn back towards the west, which could place anyone from North Carolina southward through the Florida Peninsula at a risk of being impacted by a tropical cyclone within the next 5 to 7 days. Meanwhile, the ECMWF ensembles are not quite as aggressive with showing a westerly turn in the medium range just yet. However, you do see that the models are showing a stall here as the steering currents begin to break down over the southwest Atlantic, and we are more likely to see a gradual bend more so towards the west in upcoming runs from the European model as this model starts to begin to grasp the tropical cyclone better than it has been. One tendency from the European so far is for it to struggle to even see the tropical storm, but as we start to get more data and as the storm moves into the Eastern Caribbean, we will start to see more observations going into the models, so we should start to see better agreement between the GFS and European over time. But even now, we still have a fairly good consensus within the 3 to 5 day forecast periods. All interest across the Greater Antilles extending northward into the Bahamas, and even to some extent the southeast United States, should be making at least initial preparations for the potential of a tropical cyclone threat within the next week. This is a look at the 18Z run of the operational GFS model, and this is an overall look at the entire Atlantic basin. And what we see overlaid on here is the low-level 850 millibar vorticity, and you can clearly see the presence of Tropical Storm Chantal just to the east of the Lesser Antilles. And as we fast forward through the forecast period, as we approach early Wednesday morning before sunrise, you can see that the storm is very close to San Juan, Puerto Rico, so all interest there should be bracing for at least tropical storm force winds, as it looks as though the center of circulation will pass just barely to the south of San Juan. And as we go into Wednesday afternoon, the storm is crossing Hispaniola, and it is interesting to note that the GFS has been trending a little bit towards the north over the past 24 hours, and this trend will have to be monitored closely, because in the event that the center of circulation moves just to the north of the Hispaniola coastline, then that could be setting up for a slightly stronger storm moving into the southwest Atlantic. As we continue into the forecast period, as we work our way into Thursday and eventually Friday, you can see the storm is starting to re-intensify over the northern Bahamas, and you will also start to notice that the forward motion of the storm begins to slow down as the trough really begins to move out of the area and the Atlantic subtropical ridge begins to build back towards the west, which eventually moves the storm into northern Florida and southern Georgia as we work our way into 144 hours or a Sunday afternoon based on this model solution. Also notice that it looks as though the tropics are moving into a fairly active period with a number of tropical systems that could be developing into tropical cyclones out across the central Atlantic. So this could be the first of many tropical storms to watch over the next month or so. This is the day 7 sea level pressure and precipitation forecast from the GFS, and we can see the remnants of our tropical storm continuing to move westward over southern Georgia, and we have another tropical storm on its heels out across the central Atlantic as being dictated in this run at day 7, which is now Monday afternoon. As we take a look higher up into the atmosphere, into the 500 millibar mid-level steering layer, we can see the reason why the GFS is forecasting this overall track. Beginning at the initial hour, we can see the tropical storm east of the Lesser Antilles, and also pay very close attention to this upper level steering low that is situated currently over the Bahamas. Over the next 48 to 72 hours, this upper level low is forecast to slowly meander over the Florida Peninsula, but eventually begin to move into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, while we have a much deeper long wave trough start to dive into the eastern United States, including the southeast United States and the lower Mississippi Valley. As this trough begins to split away from the primary westerly flow over North America, this in tandem with the upper level low is going to start retrograding more so toward the southwest. As we move into day 5, we can see the position of the upper level low primarily situated over Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Now, it's important to note that this is not going to be not only a major steering factor, but also a major factor in terms of the intensity of the tropical cyclone once it moves over the southwest Bahamas. If it's too close to our tropical storm, it could help to induce more in the way of southwest vertical wind shear, but if the upper level low continues to back off towards the west, it could actually open up a very favorable environment out towards the east, to the east of Daytona, Florida. This is a look at the 18Z GFS shear forecast for the same day 5 forecast period, and you can see the primary upper level low and associated southwest vertical wind shear out across the central Gulf of Mexico, but we have fairly light upper level winds out across Florida and the far western Atlantic, as we start to see more in the way of upper level divergence and ridging in this area, which is more conducive for strengthening. As we work our way into Sunday afternoon, the upper level low is still retrograding more so towards the west over the Texas-Louisiana line, and we also see more in the way of mid-level ridging that is developing out across the mid-Atlantic states. And between this mid-level ridge and the upper level low out across eastern Texas, we have an alleyway out across Florida and Georgia for the storm to make a turn more so towards the west. Now, we're not exactly thinking that the GFS will be 100% accurate in this overall mindset. However, we do feel as though a gradual turn back towards the United States is becoming increasingly likely, whether that's as far south as southern Florida or as far north as the Carolinas. Well, that just remains to be seen, along with the intensity of the cyclone once it exits Hispaniola. In the meantime, we're going to continue to pay very close attention to the overall structure of Tropical Storm Chantal as it continues to move west-northwestward towards Barbados and the rest of the islands. As we take one final look at the standard infrared and enhanced infrared satellite imagery, you can see that convection remains fairly persistent near the low-level circulation, despite the storm still being surrounded by a lot of dry air out across the central Atlantic, and we already have some isolated showers starting to work their way into the islands, as also seen here by the latest regional radar animation. So the weather is going to quickly go downhill over the eastern Caribbean over the next 24 hours. We can expect occasional power outages and heavy rainfall, especially in mountainous terrain. So hopefully all interests there are already prepared for a tropical storm landfall. Last but certainly not least, this is a look at the regional water vapor animation, and you can still see one of the major players in terms of the steering and intensity forecast of Chantal, that being the upper level low moving very slowly towards southern Florida, and you can see the westerly wind shear associated with this upper level low and the jet max streaking across the greater Antilles, including Cuba and the Hispaniola area. However, as long as this upper level low can stay well out ahead of the tropical storm, the wind shear values should remain relatively light, especially as the storm begins to slow down below 20 miles per hour as it moves into the southwest Atlantic. So we certainly have interesting times ahead for us here in the Atlantic Basin, and we are going to continue to monitor things here very closely for you at 28storms.com. And for frequent updates throughout the day, you can always turn to facebook.com/28storms for model updates, Hurricane Center track updates, along with other interesting weather photos that are being uploaded throughout the country.